Hi, I'm Eric Humphrey, and along with Dwight Zimler, we just completed a book, Growth, Modernity, and the Nations of Wealth, that deals with the puzzling question of how the West became wealthy so quickly and for so many. So, before I start into the chapter summaries, what I'd like to do is deal thematically with our notion of rationality, because there's a lot of interest that we're getting on this topic. And what we want to get out of in this book is the idea that modernity is a result of an intentional destiny, like most Enlightenment thinkers thought till the early 20th century, or, when that fails, that it's simply a given historical fate, a concatenate series of events, one damn thing after another, that boom, ends up with modernity. So you want to get out of that kind of dichotomy. So we present a kind of theory of order that is non-anthropomorphic. That is, reason doesn't need a personality and a self-consciousness to function. So our problem with formulating the modern question and figuring out how reason and rationality work in history is that our notions of reason and rationality are intimately bound up with a self-conscious personality, an executor or an agent, a theory of human nature. What we present in the book is more consistent with economics and biology. There's no internal subject that's driving things from the outset. So we don't have to reverse engineer the past into the present. And that way we can get out of this dichotomy of the God of Genesis creator or the leaf in the wind victim. So this leaves the historical analysis of modernity sort of like the early caricatures of evolutionary theory, where you would take frog ingredients and you'd put them in a blender and then you'd blend them up and you'd keep checking to see if you'd get a frog. That process won't give you a frog, and no biologist believes it. Yet historians still have this idea: if you put modern inputs, central banks, courts, institutions, rule of law, double entry bookkeeping, into a blender and spin it up, you'll eventually get modernity. This method hasn't worked very well. So how one explains the rationalization of life is going to depend a lot on how one conceives of rationality and order. So in this book's non-anthropomorphic version of rationality that's more common to Darwin and Smith, we ask the simple question: do you need a brain to be an economist? Now, most of you who have met economists are probably going to say, of course not. But I want to answer this question very seriously, and that is, of course not. You don't need a brain, but I intend to answer in a non-humorous way. That is, economic assessments are just renditions of optimal behavior that's sustainable over time by life, whether it's a tree, a worm, or you, or a human culture. So the idea that reason needs a self-conscious personality is really unnecessary. And this way it doesn't really explain problems. Rather, it evokes something that's more complex than the problem we're trying to explain. If I explain myself by an inner self, I haven't explained anything, I just made the problem more complex. So how does this version of rationality, without a planner, actually work? Because we're going to apply it to historical problems. Well, let's take an example. Consider the squirrel in the forest. Charles Darwin takes care of him. But unlike the birds in the tree in Christ's parable, our squirrel is nervous, uptight, and if you've ever been around wild animals, you'll know they all suffer from PTSD. So, he ends up acting like a pretty good economist in using his resources to survive over time. So how is it that he ends up conforming to economic models? Does he study up there in the tree? What does he do all winter? Well, he can't be sitting here counting on his abacus how many nuts he needs to generate the heat joules he needs to stay alive, less attrition from loss of other animals. Instead, his self-consciousness, whatever there is probably much more episodic. The squirrel is going, whoa, I'm hungry. Whoa, get out of my territory. Or whoa, I need a mate. So how do all these instinctual impulses add up to making him an economist? That's the question that we have to explain. So in biology and economics, it's not number one, the central planner from on high, self-consciously creating number two below, but rather it's number two from the bottom, bidding up number one. That's how you explain the spontaneous origin of order. This is a reactive kind of rationality. This is what we're going to use to explain how the West became rich. We'll end up calling it competitive rationality. So how does it really work in practice? How did the squirrel become an economist? Well, this kind of rationality is inherently historical, unlike teleological rationality, which is at war with history. Hegel and Marx end up having to kill history to understand it. But the point is to have a kind of reason that can do history. And that's what we'll offer in this book when we explain how the West became so wealthy. So when you look at the squirrel in the forest, what you see is a survivor of a process, of a historical process, where there were alternate possible squirrels. In addition to the one that's surviving, there was a bon vivant squirrel high up in the trees enjoying himself in the sunset, but he froze to death over the winter. Then there was a finicky American squirrel who didn't like the flavor of nuts, so he kind of wasted away on the margins. And then there was even a postmodern squirrel who questioned the very idea of nutness, or whether we should subscribe to the nut industrial complex. Well, he didn't make it through the summer. So the squirrel we got out of that population, that historical population of options, is a squirrel whose instincts coincide with his self-preservation. That's how we explain that the squirrel becomes an economist without going to school for 4 years. This is an inherently historical view of life. And that's why we believe it offers a lot of good insights in answering very serious questions. Nature is a stoic. She commands that life love its fate, amor fati. And that's how preservation interests come to coincide with self-preservation interests. So you can see with this type of rationality that any living being, whether it's in its genes or its ideas, a culture, has to enter into a sustainable relationship with its environment if it hopes to last. So even in culture, Greenland Inuit culture did better than Viking culture in Greenland. So it proved itself to have a better collection of sustainable ideas on how to live. And you can see with this method how the biologist Charles Darwin beats the philosopher Immanuel Kant. Because Kant thinks that the world must conform to our categories of looking at the world. That's German idealism. But Darwin would say, no, that's an ahistorical view. Those categories came into existence and they're conforming to a world. So if you're not getting something right about that world out there, you're dead squirrel. That's the enforcement mechanism of this whole idea of a reactive rationality. So that means Darwin can do history by showing how Kantians evolve over time, and he doesn't need a Hegelian adapter. Whereas Hegel must kill history, and Kant must ignore it. So to any diehard philosopher out there who's skeptical about this notion of rationality, Dwight and I are going to issue the following challenge. If the way you perceive reality is not getting something right on that electromagnetic spectrum, wherever you're perceiving or whatever sound wave you're using, if it's not getting something right about something out there, you're dead. You won't survive. So if you have an external world, you've got to be getting something right about it. So importantly, this isn't like Voltaire's Pangloss, where we live in the best of all possible worlds. That's not the kind of rationality I'm describing here. Nor is it a naively functionalist view that everything has a rational purpose. Rather, life muddles through and it experiments. This rationality is not proactive and abstractly perfect. Rather, it's reactive and locally sufficient. So it's suboptimal from the standpoint of God, but it's locally brilliant if you confine it to the context in which it operates. So life is not a special creation definitively created by an ahistorical thinker like Aristotle or Kant might have believed, but rather it's an ongoing series of regular creations in history with glitches as it probes the frontier of possibility. So with this, we might see rationality in a very different way, that what we thought was normal rationality, self-conscious rationality, is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a spectrum of rationality. There's an individual rationality that we think of as being rational, self-conscious thinking, But there's also a cultural rationality that's slower moving, but that helps coordinate large amounts of people, because you can't have a poem in English without learning English. So these are rules shared by common people. So a cultural rationality would be slower moving or stickier than an individual rationality. But in addition to this, there would also be an instinctual rationality. This would be what animals have. That is, like if you put your hand on a hot plate, you'd pull it back quickly. Now, you don't authorize that act. Your hand is insubordinate. So why did it do it? Well, because that kind of instinctual behavior, that emotional behavior, is generally statistically so good that it can be hardwired into your behavior, and it doesn't need a mind to deploy it. And this is probably how most animals live. So in these three types of rationality, what we see is an instinctual rationality, hardwired, a cultural rationality that's learned but still dogmatic, and then we see an individual rationality, which we often think is the only form of rationality possible, but it's really kind of the tip of the iceberg of rationality in nature. And you can see how it would work. For example, fish have never figured out the problem of the fishhook. They've never broken that problem. But an orca can move down a line of Chilean sea bass, which are really Patagonian toothfish, and nibble them off the hooks like it's eating hors d'oeuvres off toothpicks, whereas the standard fish just keep swallowing the toothpick to their detriment. So we could think of this spectrum then with this following kind of thought experiment. Let's say you take off on a plane, and in the three seats, you know how I travel, there's a monkey in the aisle, there's a Viking in the middle, and there's an astronaut in the window seat. And you get up to cruising altitude, and we're going to see an illustration of this cohabitation of the three types of rationality. The plane hits turbulence, the monkey's pretzels go flying, and it fires all appendages at any object to grab. The Viking's pretzels similarly go flying up in the air, but the Viking quickly grabs composure and acts like he's not afraid. And then the astronaut just sits there eating his pretzels and reading. So these three very different behaviors ensue, all on one plane. So who's being rational and who's not being rational? Well, what we're really looking at is different types of rationality that are calibrated to different time frames and different contexts. So the monkey uses a highly stereotyped kind of rationality that's so good in the history of monkey life that it doesn't need a brain. That's another fancy way of saying any monkey who said, "Gosh, I think I'm falling," would be a dead monkey. Whereas the Viking is using a kind of cultural rationality where he signals to other Vikings that he's not afraid. So then Eric and Thor will want to make sack and pillage with him, and he won't get shipped off to Iceland. So he's signaling to people. That's why he's acting so tough. Whereas the astronaut is what we think of as normal, natural, self-conscious rationality, is reading his newspaper, experiences the turbulence, and determines it's well within the design specifications of a plane, nothing to worry about. So these are the three types of rationality that reveal the historical nature of it, and that it is created through a reactive process. So with this kind of reason in our book, we think we can make a rationality capable of explaining order, and we can get out of this dichotomy of the leaf in the wind or the God of Genesis. We can get out of this historical one damn thing after another, frog in a blender kind of explanation of modernity, and come up with a real theory of order that works and explains how the West became rich. So how does this work? Well, in our particular case in the book, the rationalizing structure was the polycentric structure of Europe. And that inhibited the kinds of monopolistic problems that lead to low productivity in material life. And the competitive nature of the European system is not unique to history. So there's the Sumerian warring states, the Greek warring states, the fabulous warring states period in China, which is remarkably creative. But what's different about those competitive structures is they shut down after about 300 to 500 years. Usually several hundred years is an interdynastic interlude, Whereas the European system never created another Rome. Instead, it solidified into an efficiency trap that drove up the content, the productive content of humans and states. And that's how we explain our notion of rationality, our system of order, and how it works in this book. Thank you.